Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're digging into some really compelling research looking at a connection that's often overlooked in the criminal justice system.
That's right. We're talking about the link between a physical brain trauma and, well, youth offending.
Exactly. We're uncovering the powerful and frankly quite shocking impact of traumatic brain injury TBI on young people who end up in custody.
Yeah, for this deep dive, we've really focused on pulling apart a big systematic review. It was published in the Journal of Head Trauma Rehabilitation,
Okay.
and its mission was pretty clear. Figure out just how common TBI is among young folks in correctional settings. And crucially, how does that compare to, kids outside the system?
And this wasn't just one country, right? They looked internationally.
US, UK, Australia. So it gives us a pretty robust picture, not just a local snapshot.
Okay, so before we dive into the numbers, which I gather are pretty stark, let's just quickly define terms.
hmm
What exactly is a TBI? Just so we're all on the same page.
Sure. The CDC Centers for Disease Control, they have a pretty straightforward definition. It's basically a disruption to the brain's normal function
Okay.
caused by some kind of external force.
Right.
Could be a direct hit, something penetrating the skull, or even a force like whiplash, that makes the brain move sharply inside the skull.
Right. We're not just talking about a bump on the head here. This can actually change how the brain works, can't it? Affect behavior.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if it happens when the brain is still developing childhood, adolescence. TBI can lead to long-term neurocognitive problems.
Like what sort of things?
Well, think about the skills you need just to function day to day. Impulse control, executive functioning, that's your planning, organizing skills,
Right.
your social skills, understanding others, and even just regulating anger or aggression. TBI can impair all of those.
And, listening to that list, poor impulse control, trouble regulating aggression if you follow criminology at all, that sounds exactly like the classic risk factors they talk about for offending behavior.
Precisely. It aligns very strongly. In criminology, we often talk about different pathways into offending. And these kinds of impairments, they're really strongly linked to what's called early onset, offending starting young, maybe before 14, and also life course persistent offending. These are the individuals who, sadly, often stay involved in crime throughout their lives. A TBI can act like a vulnerability factor, kind of priming the pump for those outcomes.
Okay, so let's get into the core findings of this review. It looked at 10 studies, right? Focusing on young people already in the justice system. What did they find about lifetime prevalence? Like, had these kids ever had a TBI?
The range they found is, well, it's really quite shocking. The reported rates for lifetime TBI among these incarcerated youth went from 16.5% at the lowest.
Okay, still significant.
Yeah, about 1 in 6, but it went all the way up to 72.1% in some studies.
72%. That's
Yeah.
nearly 3/4.
Yeah.
That's huge. It can't be a coincidence.
It strongly suggests a systemic issue, absolutely. It points to just massive levels of underlying need in this population. And there was one sort of small but very telling detail mention. A study, tiny sample, only 14 young people, but they were all on death row.
Oh, wow.
It found that 100% of them reported having some kind of head injury during childhood. Now, you can't generalize from 14 people, obviously, but it really underscores this potential link in the most extreme cases.
But that range itself, 16.5% up to 72.1%, that's a massive difference between studies. What explains that? Were they measuring different things?
That's the key. The review points to what they call heterogeneity in definitions. Basically, how did each study decide what counts as a TBI?
Right.
Some used a really broad definition, like any reported head injury. That could include minor cuts, whiplash, things that might not have caused actual lasting brain disruption.
So the 72% figure probably includes a lot of those milder, maybe less impactful injuries.
Likely, yes. Whereas the lower figures, like the 16.5%, they came from studies using much stricter criteria. They often required proof, like medical records, or specifically asked about TBI that caused a loss of consciousness LOC, sometimes for a specific minimum time.
So stricter definition, lower rate, makes sense. But even 16.5% sounds high compared to the general population. What is the comparison?
That's the critical point. The evidence across all the countries looked at was really consistent and strong on this. The rate of TBI among young people in custody is substantially higher than in the general youth population.
Substantially higher. Okay.
The gap isn't just noticeable, it's described as profound.
And I remember seeing something in the notes that was really striking. It wasn't just that there was a gap, but that the gap seemed to get wider when you looked at more severe injuries. Is that right?
Yes, that's perhaps the most compelling piece because it cuts through some of that noise about definitions. Let's take a specific measure, TBI involving any loss of consciousness, even just for a moment.
Okay.
Among the incarcerated youth samples, the rates went up as high as 49.7%, nearly half.
Wow. And for kids generally.
In general population studies, the rates for TBI with any LOC usually fall somewhere between 5% and maybe 24%.
Yeah.
So you're already looking at potentially double or triple the rate.
Okay, that's a clear difference. But what about the really serious injuries?
Yeah.
The ones you know probably had a significant impact.
Right. So researchers also look specifically at TBI, resulting in loss of consciousness lasting longer than 20 minutes. This is often considered a marker for more severe injury.
And the rate there.
In the incarcerated samples, the rate for that specific type of severe TBI was reported at 18.3%.
18.3%. How does that compare?
Well, when you match that against general population studies that use similarly strict criteria for severe TBI, the comparison suggests nearly a 4 times increase among the incarcerated youth.
4 times.
Yeah. 4 times the rate of serious, significant head injuries. It strongly suggests that the severity of the trauma is really closely linked to the risk of ending up in the justice system.
Okay, so this brings us to the really complex question, doesn't it? We see this strong correlation. TBI is way more common in young offenders. But is the TBI causing the behavior, or does the lifestyle associated with offending cause the TBI? The chicken and egg thing.
Exactly, and the review is very clear. This correlation isn't simple causation. It's almost certainly a two-way street.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you're already involved in high-risk behaviors, maybe gang involvement, fighting, substance abuse that leads to accidents, your chances of getting a TBI are just statistically higher. Assaults, for instance, account for something like 11% of TBIs.
So the lifestyle itself increases the injury risk. Makes sense.
Definitely. But at the same time, the TBI itself causes those neurological problems we talked about, the poor impulse control, the difficulty reading social situations, maybe struggling at school because of cognitive issues.
Right.
All of that makes a young person much more vulnerable to making choices that lead towards antisocial behavior. The TBI doesn't, make them commit a crime, but it seriously compromises their ability to handle conflict, frustration, or complex social situations in a positive way.
It lowers their threshold for coping, maybe?
Yeah,
Makes them more reactive?
that's a good way to put it. It creates a much higher risk pathway. But there's another layer here you mentioned earlier, which is critical. TBI doesn't just increase the risk of offending, it increases the risk of criminalization.
Explain that distinction again, because I think it's really important.
It is. It's about how the system interacts with the young person. Imagine someone with TBI-related executive function problems. Maybe they struggle to follow a long conversation. They can't easily organize their thoughts to tell a story chronologically. Maybe their emotional responses seem a bit off or flat because of the injury.
Okay.
Now put that young person in a police interview or in court. They might struggle to answer questions clearly. They might seem confused, agitated, or maybe overly passive. Poor eye contact, perhaps.
And to someone who isn't trained to recognize TBI symptoms, that could look like they're being difficult, lying, or just don't care.
Exactly. It looks like non-compliance or evasiveness. So their actual neurological impairment, their difficulty engaging with the process because of the injury, gets misinterpreted. And that misinterpretation can lead directly to them being arrested, charged, convicted, perhaps more readily than someone without those impairments, regardless of the actual facts of the situation.
They're essentially penalized for the symptoms of their injury.
In effect, yes. The impairment itself makes them more vulnerable to getting caught up and perhaps pushed deeper into the system.
That's sobering. And it suggests the system is just not set up to handle this.
Looking ahead then, what were the big gaps the review identified? Where does the research still need to go?
A major one was what they called the comorbidity gap. Comorbidity just means having more than one condition at the same time.
And incredibly, none of the 10 studies they reviewed actually looked at how often TBI occurred alongside other issues like, say, ADHD or speech and language disorders or mental health problems like depression, even though we know TBI increases the risk for all those things.
So we might be seeing the TBI, but missing other connected problems.
Precisely. Think about it. A kid has a TBI and maybe undiagnosed ADHD and maybe depression stemming from the injury or their life circumstances. Their needs are incredibly complex, layered. If systems are only screening for or thinking about TBI in isolation, they're likely missing a huge part of the picture and underestimating the level of support needed.
So we're potentially dealing with multiple interacting diagnoses, maybe all stemming back to that initial brain injury, but the system only sees one piece, if any.
That's the concern. We desperately need research that looks at these intersections. Another area where things were a bit murky was around sociodemographics, like gender.
What did they find there? Was it mostly boys?
Well, in the general population, yes, boys and young men tend to have higher rates of TBI, often linked to risk-taking. And a couple of the studies in the review found that pattern held true in custody, too. But interestingly, two other big studies found almost equal rates of TBI between young men and young women in custody.
Oh, really? That's surprising.
It is, and it suggests that maybe the pathways into TBI and offending for young women in the justice system are just as significant, but perhaps different. We need to understand that much better.
And what about ethnicity? Did TBI seem to be a risk factor across different groups?
The data was pretty limited, honestly. But the initial signs, for example, from one Australian study comparing Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal youth, suggested that while there might be some differences in overall rates linked to broader social inequalities, TBI itself seemed to be a really important factor for both groups. It suggests the physical injury is a potent risk factor in its own right, regardless of background. But again, much more research is needed there, especially larger studies looking carefully at race and ethnicity.
Okay, so we have this picture of vastly elevated rates of TBI, especially severe TBI, linked to offending, linked to problems navigating the justice system, potentially interacting with other conditions. What does this mean for policy? What should the justice system be doing right now?
The sheer scale of the need really demands action on, I'd say, three main fronts. First, screening and assessment. It has to become routine.
Like everyone who comes into the youth justice system gets screened for TBI.
Ideally, yes. Proper screening and then more detailed assessment for those who screen positive. This isn't just about identifying individual needs, though that's crucial for case management. It's also about understanding the collective need within a facility or system so you can plan and resource appropriate services and support.
Shifting the question from just what did they do to what underlying issues might be contributing.
Exactly. Second, the processes within the justice system need rethinking. We talked about that vulnerability to criminalization.
Right, the interviews, court.
Yeah. Police interview techniques, how information is presented in court, even how diversion programs are structured, they all need to be adapted. We need TBI-informed practices that can accommodate young people who genuinely struggle with communication, memory, or impulse control because of their injury. You can't demand a level of engagement or understanding that someone is neurologically incapable of providing.
That sounds like a massive overhaul for systems that are often pretty resistant to change.
It's a huge challenge, no doubt, but the alternative is continuing a cycle where the system itself might be making things worse for these vulnerable young people, leading to more reoffending. Which brings us to the third point, prevention.
Getting in before they even reach the justice system.
Absolutely. We have to shift focus upstream, way upstream. This means better preventative services and much earlier intervention, often starting outside justice altogether.
What would that look like?
Well, the review suggests simple things. Maybe not simple to implement, but conceptually straightforward, like better sharing of information. If a child has a significant head injury from a fall, maybe playing sports, an accident, that information needs to follow them. Health services talking to schools, for instance.
So schools are aware of potential learning or behavioral issues down the line.
Yes, and families too. Providing routine, maybe long-term follow-up support after a significant childhood TBI. Educating parents and teachers about the potential long-term impacts, providing strategies, offering support before major problems develop. If we can intervene early, give kids the cognitive, emotional, behavioral support they need to manage the effects of the injury, maybe we can actually divert them from that high-risk trajectory altogether.
So this deep dive, it really took us from analyzing the data in a journal review to seeing this profound hidden vulnerability TBI that seems to be potentially fueling serious, persistent offending. And tackling it requires changes across health, education, and the justice system.
It really does connect all those dots. And maybe, just to leave you with a final thought to chew on, thinking about that prevention angle.
Okay.
We know most childhood TBIs aren't from crime. They're from falls, accidents, everyday life. If we actually invested properly in routine follow-up and support, starting right when those injuries happen in childhood in hospitals and schools, could that kind of upstream neurological support actually turn out to be one of the most effective, and maybe even cost-effective, forms of crime prevention we have? It really challenges us to think about where prevention truly begins.